Greetings. My name is Mel Zabecki. I'm the Education Outreach Coordinator for the Arkansas Archaeological Survey.
And I'm Amy Warren. I'm the NSF Grant Director at Northwest Arkansas Community College.
And today we're going to talk about a program called Engineering Our Past. So we're going to talk about archaeology. So I'm going to ask, what is archaeology and how can it be social studies and STEM related? So basically, archaeology, in a small nutshell, is a systematic study of past cultures. And when we're talking about past culture, of course, we're going to be inherently talking about social studies and history. But we study it systematically, so that brings in a lot of math and science concepts. So, of course, with the social studies and history, there's material culture that is gathered from the artifacts that are excavated in archaeological excavations. And those kinds of artifacts inform us about the language and the art and the trade, economics, religion, foodways, gender, and kinship patterns of past cultures. But the way that we study them is really, again, related to the math and science fields and engineering fields as well, as you'll find out in this talk. And I'm going to go through a lot of these different things that are STEM related in the next few slides. So I'm going to be talking what archaeology is not, and then how we go about doing archaeology using all these math and science concepts. So what archaeology is not is nothing about dinosaurs, just as a reminder, because a lot of people have lots of preconceived ideas about what archaeology is, but it's not digging up dinosaurs. That's paleontology. Again, it's not digging up fossils either, any kind of fossils like that. It has nothing to do with the movies that we see, nor the video games that we play. It really has to do with past culture again, and the things that we learn from either looking at the artifacts or looking at other features in the ground. And it's all a reconstruction of culture. So we begin reconstructing the culture through a lot of scientific sampling and trying to plan out how we are going to study these things. So as any other scientists have to do, they have to decide what they're going to study and take a small sample of that area, because you can't dig up the whole site, just like you can't collect all of the data from a population of whatever you're studying as another kind of scientist. So we have this stuff called remote sensing, and it entails using these large pieces or small pieces of equipment that you see in the two pictures on the left. And there are things that kind of shoot energy or shoot sound into the ground to try to inform us about what might be under the ground, based on disturbed soils, burned soils, soils that are wetter than other soils due to being disturbed. So there's lots of different ways that it's studied, but basically it helps us try to pinpoint an area that we're going to dig. And so on the right-hand side, you see we call it the blob of the data that was collected through remote sensing. And then the yellow boxes on it are the sample that we decide to take. So we're going to dig in those squares, and that's the area that we'll focus on. So those little yellow squares are transformed into the picture on the left-hand side. That's a sky view of the units. And when we do excavation in the grid, and that means that we instill a grid on the landscape in the cardinal direction, so north, focus north-south. And so those squares that you see in the picture on the left are actually oriented north-south. They look a little off-kilter because the rest of everything is kind of in a different organization. But basically, you can see that we dig in squares, and that's so that we can get coordinates, the east and west and north and south coordinates of anything we find inside of those squares, and that we can reproduce it on a computer or on paper, so that later on we'll have the record of exactly where things were found. And it's real important, to have all these squares very accurately created. And we're going to look at an activity later on that will show how important it is to have accurate placement of these squares. And then when we're finally excavating, after all the planning and after all the grid laying out, there's a ton of data collection that occurs, whether it be photographs of small things that you can't probably even see what Emily is taking a picture of here, but it's a stain in the ground. So it's not necessarily just artifacts. So we collect every bit of information that comes out of the field. We collect information on soil and the soil types and the soil colors. We have lots of reference catalogs and reference things that we use. And we also map everything. And most of the time we map stuff by hand, as shown on the top left picture, and then of course on the hand-drawn map on the right. But we also use total station, which means basically it's one of those things that you see on the highway with the surveyors, and it accurately pinpoints where things are in the ground. So there's lots of technology that goes into doing archaeology in the field, even if a lot of it happens to be with dirt and buckets. But then the real magic happens in the lab. And a lot of people don't think about the lab because, you know, taking pictures in the field is so much more picturesque and seems like it's much more exciting, but really the discovery does happen in the lab. So it entails all of these different activities: cleaning and drying and labeling and sorting and identifying and classifying. And then, you know, the science stuff comes in with the weighing and the measuring and other data collection and tallying things and using instruments to measure. So there's lots of, it's like a science lab when you go into an archaeology lab. There's all kinds of specialized analysis as well. So these are done not necessarily by all archaeologists, but there are archaeologists that just focus on biology, that study animal bones or human remains. There are people that are botanists that study the seed remains to understand the origins of agriculture, or just generally reconstructing the diet of what people were eating back then. That we take lots of radiocarbon samples for dating purposes. And then there's a ton of kinds of chemical studies that have to do with either isotope analysis, trying to reconstruct the environment or diet of the people or the animals from the area. And there's also other kinds of chemical studies like residue analysis to study pottery and understand what was in that pot when it was buried or discarded. So this obviously goes without saying that there's tons of science and then a technology in all of these kinds of studies, and of course math, because there's tons of data collection, tons of measuring, all kinds of statistical analyses. So you know, we are just as much scientists as we are social scientists in archaeology. Then finally, this is sort of the fun stuff, the experimental archaeology, which means trying to figure out what people were doing in the past with these objects and with these raw materials, and also using technology to help share information and share data between either regular people, you know, the lay public, or scientists. So we have, we've been doing lots of, archaeologists have been doing tons of 3D scanning for manipulation on a screen, but also 3D printing to reproduce objects, to be, you know, to be able to pass around the less fragile objects, but still get a good idea of the size and shape of things. And then experimenting with raw materials can take on any form. You can butcher a catfish with stone tools. You can recreate all kinds of farming implements and tree felling implements with stone tools. These are actual replicas that were made by some archaeologists at the Arkansas Archaeological Survey. You can experiment with different ways of hunting by using blow guns or other farming tools, or hunting tools like the atlatl, the spear thrower. And this all, you know, it seems like it's all in good fun, but it also gives us just a great idea, and it makes us connect to the past a lot better and understand not just how people were doing things, but how, you know, kind of how ingenious they had to be be able to figure all these things out. And there's a lot of engineering that goes into this stuff, even if the past peoples weren't necessarily thinking, oh, if I extend my arm with this lever that is an atlatl, you know, they weren't thinking this, but they figured it out. And now, you know, archaeologists get to reinterpret it and explain this. I want to urge you to think about bringing archaeology into your classroom, because believe it or not, archaeology can save the world. First of all, I mean, just in a very basic sense for y'all, for teachers, it does, you know, help with scientific literacy. There's lots of jargon that goes along with all of these different specialized topics within archaeology and just doing the data collection in general, but also it gives us cultural literacy, and that brings forth many, many tolerances and understandings of not just past cultures, but current cultures as well. Lots of extra bonuses for archaeology studies, which is deep time perspective. It gives you a much better perspective on the rest of the world and an understanding of how the earth got to this point. You can use it as a tool for social justice and for, again, fostering cultural empathy. Multidisciplinary study, because it brings in all of the STEM courses and the social studies and history, and also citizenship lessons and teamwork exercises. So all of these different things are part of what it is to study archaeology.
So the activities that we're presenting today came out of a collaboration between Mel and I. At that time, I was working as the STEM outreach director for the University of Arkansas College of Engineering. And here I was, a bioarchaeologist who found myself in amongst a bunch of engineers leading camps for K-12 students. And from the moment I stepped on campus in that position, I knew that there was some way that we could integrate my background in archaeology with the engineering content that we were trying to share with Arkansas students. I knew, and we want to give you the tools to help your students know, that prehistoric people were engineers. They were developing new technologies that made their lives easier, that made their lives more efficient. So you may not think of a bow and arrow when I ask you to name a technology. Most people immediately go to, you know, their cell phone or computer, some sort of electronic device. But the significance of the bow and arrow on human society cannot be overstated. It's one of the most significant technological advances in humanity. And so it's really great to teach our students to think about technologies as something that doesn't have to be plugged in as well. Archaeology is a great starting point for bringing students into the STEM disciplines as well, because it is more accessible to them because of the unfortunate pop culture references. So even though we want them to understand that Indiana Jones and Lara Croft Tomb Raider are not accurate representations of what actual archaeologists do, it is a great jumping off point to start correcting those misconceptions and teaching them about the real work of archaeologists. So with those things in mind, we developed our Engineering Our Past summer camp. PAST is an acronym for Prehistoric Arkansas Stories and Technologies. So as Mel and I were collaborating, we knew that we needed to focus on really kind of two main areas where archaeology and engineering integrate. The first of those areas is letting students see the ways that prehistoric people were engineers in their own right. So teaching them about the technologies that prehistoric Arkansans and Native Americans more broadly developed. And then the second kind of strategy was the tools that modern archaeologists use that were developed in concert with engineers in order to help us inform archaeologists about human prehistory. And so without the work of engineers, we would not be able to do a lot of those kind of experimental archaeology type things that Mel discussed previously. Mel, can we go to the next slide? And the next slide. For the 2019 version of the Engineering Our Past camp, we developed enough activities to fill an entire week. The content runs from about 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. And we were able to go between the Arkansas Archaeological Survey coordinating office in Fayetteville and the University of Arkansas campus and College of Engineering entities. We focused on a girls' camp for this first year, because you don't necessarily think that middle school girls are going to be particularly captivated by engineering, but they are pretty interested in archaeology. So it was a really, really great starting point. So we developed activities that centered on foraging optimization, which we're going to discuss today, discovering seasonality of diets based on like fecal analysis. We did bioarchaeology stations, ceramics. We had the opportunity to go into archaeology labs and other labs on campus where they were developing or applying technologies to archaeological questions. We developed prehistoric weapons. We took a field trip to spiral mounds. We really figured out a great way to integrate all of these things. Today, we are going to specifically be discussing 3 of these activities, but would be happy to help work on developing any of these for your classrooms. Because of the limited time we have available, we're not going through like a full formal lesson. We're not expecting you to be able to take what you hear today and bring it into your classroom wholesale. We just really want to start these conversations and give you some ideas, and then we'll be happy to work with you on implementation. So we're going to be discussing first the hunters and gatherers in Arkansas foraging optimization activity. And the origins of this activity are actually from our engineering camps. It's very difficult to find industrial engineering activities that are accessible to K-12 students because sometimes industrial engineers don't even know what industrial engineers do. But really, they are looking for good solutions to problems, and it doesn't necessarily have to be developing a physical technology. They're more about developing processes. So in this activity, we have the students become the prehistoric Arkansans. And they learn about optimal foraging strategies, which is a way to be sure that you have enough calories without expending too much energy. And they do that by using strategies from mathematics and industrial engineering. So we do this optimization activity in a lot of different contexts. If we were doing a pandemic camp, we would talk about how would we lay out a hospital to keep infectious people away from, say, the baby nursery or the geriatric ward. This type of optimization activity really is kind of able to be tailored to any context that you're trying to teach, but it's very, very well suited for this foraging activity. So as I've already mentioned, the students will walk away from this activity understanding that prehistoric people of Arkansas had to hunt and forage for their food. Agriculture did not exist. Grocery stores certainly did not exist for most of the time that humans have occupied what is now Arkansas. There are plenty of native plants and animals that are great for eating, but it is important that we don't get students too enthusiastic about these native plants and gathering and foraging unless they have someone who's very well trained in recognizing what's safe to eat. And then we'll use those strategies from math and engineering to maximize the number of calories they can hunt or gather while using the least amount of energy. This integrates social studies, science, math, and engineering. This was created as an interactive group activity, which I will discuss how to implement that. But for purposes of today and today's classroom environment, this is an individual independent work activity based on worksheets right now. So as part of this activity, students are going to learn some background information on prehistoric foodways, prehistoric nutrition, kind of the origins of economics. We know now that if you don't have enough money, you can't buy something. If you don't have enough energy, you can't forage for something, or you can't go hunting if it's a 5-mile hike to get to your hunting or gathering spot. They're also going to learn about Native Americans from the Archaic period. They're going to learn some terms that describe our Native American groups, in this case, nomadic groups that don't have permanent settlements. And then they're going to learn a little bit about optimization strategies and what industrial engineers actually do. So during the actual activity, students will go through 2 rounds of foraging on their worksheets. Each of them will be provided with a worksheet that looks like the image pictured here, which is a map of Arkansas with food resources distributed throughout the state. Each food resource is linked to several others with a line that has a point value associated with it. Those point values are arbitrary energy units based on the distance that they would have to travel to get from food resource to food resource. So for the first round of activities, students will go pick a starting point. If you want to have them, randomly pick a starting point or assign different starting points, that's completely up to you. And then they try to determine pathways across the state to gather as many calories as possible. So Students are also provided a chart that shows them the number of calories associated with each wild food resource. So they would be tracking the amount of calories that they're gathering. So for example, the rabbit, per 100 grams of rabbit, it's 114 calories. To get to the acorn, it is 5 units of energy, and the acorns provide 509 calories per 100 grams. So students are going to be consistently tracking the energy expended and the number of calories that they have been able to hunt or gather. After they finish that first round, they report out, talk about some strategies they used, maybe those high calorie foods or those pathways that are lower energy but higher reward. In the second round, you give them a limited amount of energy. How many calories can you expend or can you gather if you expend less than, say, 15 units of energy? This becomes the optimization activity, and they really have to think hard about the most efficient pathways and the highest reward foods. The foraging optimization extension and the way that we have implemented it in camps and in classrooms is by actually drawing the map of Arkansas out with tape on very large tarps and putting the wild food resources at the nodes where lines intersect, and then dividing the students into groups or pairs, and having them make a contest on who can gather the most calories with expending the least amount of energy. The students really like being able to walk along the paths, and even though it sounds like it may not be that engaging, students are very competitive when it involves a competition, as you well know. And so this really is a great way to get students engaged in math and optimization that may not be, the most exciting thing on its surface. We do want to give credit. A lot of the information and the ideas for this activity came from a 5th grade social studies curriculum developed by the Arkansas Archaeological Survey called Gathering, Gardening, and Agriculture. And this explores foodways of the Southeast through time. If you go to the link at the top of this slide, the archeology.uark.edu/GGA, you'll find all of the curriculum, additional teacher resources, everything you need to implement this in your classroom. And Mel is currently working on adding a new science supplement that more closely aligns with the Arkansas science standards, in addition to the social studies standards that it currently aligns with.
Okay, let's talk about another activity that we've done with various groups, including our Engineering Our Past camp. This is a thing that we do as archaeologists, map in the grids. And I already mentioned that in the introduction, as far as laying stuff out and making sure that we have everything measured very accurately before we remove it from the ground. So first of all, we're going to look at the, in this activity, the students would apply math and measurement skills to measure and understand spatial concepts, and then later take that information as far as the data they collected from those spatial things and look at different activity use areas at an archaeological site. They're going to apply the concept of two-dimensional coordinate system, the XY coordinate system, and then they're going to draw features to scale. So that's always, that actually is, continues to be a challenging thing even for adults to do. And then they're going to look at the spatial data and change it into numerical data for activity interpretation. This obviously includes math, science, but then when you're talking about the activities, you're looking at social studies. And originally, of course, it was something for groups, but we've also thought about ways of creating these things for independent working. So as far as looking at some of the key terms they would be learning in this type of activity, they would learn site grid, coordinates. I mentioned XY, but they also would learn Z coordinates if you take on extra parts of the activity. They'll learn about the cardinal directions and how important it is to understand which way you're looking at things, the scale, the metric system, because that's what archaeologists use, and then apply the math Pythagorean theorem to it. to the, by using the activity. So as far as laying out the grid, this is usually a very active kind of activity as far as getting down on the ground and doing teamwork and learning geometry and using that Pythagorean theorem. And basically what we do here is we run a line down the center of the room or on a tarp. We love using tarps because you can draw all over them, walk all over them, and it just is an exciting kind of thing to do. But put a line down the middle and measure out 1 meter increments, and then have teams create triangles that flip from one side to the other to create 1 meter units. And they have to figure out the math and figure out where the hypotenuse is going to be, and then work together to create these very accurate squares. And then of course you have to test them and make sure they're the right shape and size. And then if they're not, they got to start over. So it's a great application of math that's actually sort of fun to do. It definitely also helps with patience, because the teamwork for 3 people working on one little square, it can, things can become kind of heated sometimes. The individual option would just be to have a piece of paper with a line drawn down the middle, and the student would do sort of this kind of thing, but in miniature form. So it wouldn't be a whole meter, you'd have to scale it down. But again, it sort of helps out with understanding the metric system, because you have to kind of think different ways when you have that. Now, as far as when you've got the grid laid out or you have a square, then you can practice being an archaeologist in the more specific sense as far as mapping objects. So while you're within that grid, you could throw objects down on the floor, depending on what your theme might be as far as what they're learning in class for the different types of material culture that would come about from these different cultures, and put these things on, and then they'd have to map within their squares and get those things accurate, as well as drawing those objects to scale. And that's, again, sort of a very complicated process, even for adult archaeologists to be doing. So again, it tests your patience, but it's very great to apply instead of just having imaginary weird dots on a graph that I remember learning about that made no sense to me. Having the actual objects and understanding why it's so important to have them accurately mapped is much more fun. And then another really fun part is that you can have an individual activity where you have where you teach them how to graph things in front of their faces, but transfer them onto a map. And by the way, the reason we map things by hand instead of just using photographs to recreate the situation is because photographs never pick up everything that you want that could be really important for the data collection, especially when you're taking pictures of brown dirt with dirty brown artifacts. So just to let you know why we actually do these kinds of maps. But this is called the cookie dig or the cookie excavation. And basically you can find, there's tons and tons of just Google cookie excavation. And I promise you'll come up with at least 5 or 6 worksheets. So we don't have any links to it right now, but all you got to do is Google cookie excavation, and there's tons of people that have recreated this. But basically what they do is, you put a cookie, or if they're at home, they can bring objects from somewhere inside their house and place them on the grid, and then transfer that information down by using rulers to measure how far apart things are. Or if you've got this nice little grid, they can just count across and then transfer the information of the outline and the chips, and then they can excavate the chips out to find chips underneath and map all that stuff in. So it's really a fun activity, especially because when they break the cookie apart to get the chips, they wind up eating them at the end, so they get a snack. So there's lots of incentive to get to the end of this, but they enjoy the process of it as well. And then this is something that's probably more applicable to face-to-face learning, but understanding a vertical context is something that archaeologists have to deal with aside from the horizontal context, because once you remove something from one layer, you're never going to remember where it was before. And if it's connected to something underneath of it, you want to be able to understand that. So I've done various different activities of sort of simulated digs that we try very hard to avoid the concept of treasure hunting. So when we do these things, we're making them measure both the horizontal and the vertical context of where the artifacts are found before they ever touch them or remove them. So whether it be in a sterilite box or a shoe box with sand, the artifacts are placed in there, but everything gets mapped out instead of the kids just willy-nilly digging for stuff. So if you ever do this, make sure it's not, that it's a systematic data collection, not a treasure hunt. just something that we try to make sure that we try to avoid as archaeologists. And then finally, with any kind of data collection, whether you're talking about the horizontal or the vertical context, it's also a great idea to tally up the objects and put them in tables and graphs to understand areas of use where things, where the density occurs. So you can sort of reconstruct what happened in different parts of either the site or whatever. And also if only one team of kids has one of those grid squares, they won't necessarily see the entire picture until you put it all together, whether it be in the boxes, tallying them up. And so, and then as far as when you do tally it up and you have, if you don't necessarily have an activity like this where all the stuff is grouped on the floor and you can see things in context, by tallying things up and looking at the clumpings, you can try to start interpreting what the distribution of the artifacts means and understand how the site was used. So it brings it into a higher level of learning because of the data interpretation. And even if there's no right answers, it can still be just a very good practice in data organization and data interpretation, which is obviously a life skill that is very applicable as kids get older.
All right, so the final activity we're going to describe to you today is about mound builders. And this is actually a pretty geometry heavy activity for students. It just really contextualizes the mathematics of calculating volume for kind of irregular shapes. So in the mound building activity, students learn about what prehistoric mound builders. So there were prehistoric people in North America and even in Arkansas who built mounds for a variety of purposes. Students can also learn about the ways that mounds were constructed. They can recognize differences in mound shape, size, and use. And they can also learn to calculate the amount of soil that was required to build some of the best known Native American mounds. I like to say famous mounds, and then I realized that when I'm talking to most people, they don't realize that there are famous mounds in North America. When people think of like large scale Native American works, they often think of things like in Mesoamerica, like the Mexican pyramids at Chichen Itza or things like that. It's important to recognize that these kind of grand construction projects also happened right in this area, and it's a really great way to connect students with the prehistoric peoples of Arkansas. So this activity can combine social studies, science, math, and engineering, but as I said, it's pretty mathematics heavy. It takes about 45 minutes. And again, what I'm talking about today is very specifically can be done as independent work off of a worksheet or off of a presentation. It can be done virtually or face-to-face. The extension activity is an outdoor group activity if that's something that you can make work in this current time, or maybe just keep in your back pocket for later. So in this activity, students learn a variety of terms about mounds. They learn that mounds can be used for ceremonial purposes, residential purposes. A lot of people think that all mounds were used for burials, and that's actually kind of the opposite of true. Most mounds are not burial mounds. They have other purposes. They can learn about the different phases that archaeologists use to describe Arkansas prehistory, from archaic to woodland to Mississippian. They can learn about this amazing World Heritage site that we have that's just 5 hours away outside of St. Louis called Cahokia. It is, like I said, a World Heritage site. There are very few of those globally, and it's kind of right in our backyard, and it's a great place to, if you're going to St. Louis anyway, to take a side trip to see the monumental earthworks of Cahokia. And then they also learn to describe mounds as platform mounds or conical mounds, and understand some additional terminology about construction of mounds. So I like to say the most famous mound in North America is a mound called Monk's Mound. This is at Cahokia. It's Mound 38 at Cahokia. At one point at Cahokia, there were hundreds of mounds. Cahokia is a site that at its greatest point probably hosted up to about 20,000 people, at least for part of the year. This makes it larger than many of the European cities that, that would be contemporary with it. But people don't really know that Cahokia even exists anymore. It is right across the river from downtown St. Louis. If you stand on top of Monk's Mound, you can see the St. Louis Arch very, very clearly. It dates to about 8900 to 950. So a relatively short period of time, and belongs to what we call the Mississippian culture. Monk's Mound contains approximately 622,000 square meters of soil. And we like to take numbers that seem that large and turn them into something that are accessible to students. And so we use these 14-liter plastic buckets, and it would take 44 million of those buckets in order to create Monk's Mound. The people at Cahokia who built Monk's Mound would have been using baskets to move the dirt. About the same size as these buckets. So it gives them an idea of how many people and how many man hours would have been required to create something this, this large. I've also heard it said that it would take dump trucks basically lined up end to end from Cahokia, trailing all the way down to Joplin to equal the amount of dirt that's contained in Monk's Mound. So there are different types of mounds. Monk's Mound that you just saw is called a platform mound, and actually it's a double layer platform mound. So you go up one series of steps to one platform, and then you go up another series of steps to the main platform. So if you were to calculate the volume of that, you would actually be calculating the volume of two different shapes. For the students, it's probably easier to think about calculating volume of mounds when it comes to the conical mounds. And we have two conical mounds that we pictured here. We're going to focus actually on Mound C at Toltec Mounds, which is in Scott, Arkansas. Dates to 700 to 1050 AD and belongs to the Plum Bayou culture, which is part of the woodland period, the period that immediately precedes the Mississippian time. It's about 4.2 meters tall and has an 18-meter radius of its base. These mounds can be found all over the southeastern United States, as you can see from looking at this picture of Great Creek Mound in Moundville, West Virginia. So students would be given a worksheet that provides all of the measurements of the mounds, and then the formulas for calculating their volume. For a conical mound calculation, the volume is pi r squared h over 3. And you can see how we have calculated those out. It really is kind of a plug and chug math problem. But then where we try to bring it to life is by converting it to liters. So the volume of the Mound C at Toltec is 1,424 meters cubed. Converting that to liters by multiplying it by 1,000 gives us over 1 million liters. And students do understand what a liter is, especially if you show them a 1 liter soda or water bottle. Converting that to our 14-liter buckets, it's 101,736 buckets. And that tells you, even though it looks like a really small mound compared to Monk's Mound, it still takes so much effort and energy by the prehistoric people to construct them. The extension for the mound building activity is actually to have your students move the dirt with these 15 or 14-liter buckets. I think this activity, this is from the Engineering Our Past camp, took them about an hour to create a tiny little less than 1 meter pile. So students are really able to understand the amount of energy that goes into constructing the mounds, and they're also able to really understand and even kind of extrapolate from the number of bucketfuls that they use to build their tiny mound, how long it would take them to build some of these better known mounds. So those are the activities that we wanted to focus on today that have really, really clear ties to the STEM curriculum in our classrooms. But we do have other activity options, some of which I mentioned briefly earlier. We taught students bioarchaeology and biology, which was really analysis of human and animal skeletal remains. We did ceramics activities, both making ceramics and also reconstructing them. We taught them how to do soil cores and how to interpret soil cores. We also had them build different types of prehistoric weapons so they could see how the efficiency changes through time. They also were able to construct prehistoric drills. These are all activities that we'd be happy to assist you with bringing to your classroom. If things ever reopen, we'd also love to invite you and put you in touch with people to allow for field trips to the Arkansas Archaeological Survey building in Fayetteville, or to the U of A campus to visit the Center for Advanced Spatial Technologies or the XRF lab. There's also Spiral Mounds in Oklahoma, which is really a great resource for you if you're maybe in Fort Smith. And Mel's going to tell us about some resources within the state of Arkansas.
So the Arkansas Archaeological Survey actually has 10 stations located around the state, and you can see them in the squares and the little half circles there. And so we have archaeologists and assistants stationed at all of these different places, and they're sort of in charge of the different surrounding regions. And they are available for, again, if we open back up, they're available for classroom visits, but we have been doing a lot of Zoom visits lately. So feel free to contact anybody at the stations. If you go to the link archaeology.york.edu, who we are research stations, you can just click on the county that you're in, and that will give you the contact information for your local archaeologist, or just get in contact with me. The next slide has our information. So feel free, if you do want any kind of classroom resources developed, or just a guest speaker to come in, or to come into to Zoom into your classroom, we'd love to help you. That's what we're here for. And thanks so much for listening today.